and welcome to Archeo Thursday. My name is David Gadsby, and I'm pinch hosting for Karen Mudar, who's on detail to the Office of Communication this month. I'm an archaeologist in the NPS Washington Archaeology Program, which is hosting this series. This fall and winter, we're exploring the Anthropocene, climate change, and archaeology. In our upcoming talk on January 22nd, that's next week, Ellen Wohl of the Colorado State University will explore the impact of human activities on wilderness from a geomorphological perspective in a talk titled, Is Wilderness Dead? Legacies of Past Land Use and Covert Contemporary Human Effects in the Anthropocene. Wohl's research examines the intensity of human use of ecosystem services and the manipulation of water, sediment, and nutrients at the Earth's surface and near surface. Wohl observes through a synthesis of existing studies that wilderness is effectively gone and explores the implication for critical zone studies and management from a geomorphological perspective. And then she further looks at some of the management implications of her work. And argues that the understanding the history of manipulation of ecosystem services and soils and sediments and its continued influence on ecosystems and landforms are useful in a forward-looking approach to prediction and management. So that is coming next week. Last week we had Jay Sturdivant from the Midwest Archaeology Center. He presented his research on the effects of wildland fire on historic archaeology sites. He reported that historical archaeology sites with their relatively high proportions of organic materials are particularly vulnerable to damage from wildland fire. Projections of increasing wildland fire frequency, fuels accumulations, and fire intensities combined with longer fire seasons and imply that archaeologists may face a growing threat to the preservation of historic period sites. Resource managers will be challenged to adequately protect sites as climate variability and uncertainty increase. Jay's presentation provided an overview of threatened sites in the Midwest, discussed the potential for increased impact from climate change, and proposed strategies to protect sites through management action. Today, we have Marcy Rockman, who's going to discuss the intersection of, she's going to continue our discussions of the intersections of climate change and archaeology. She'll discuss her work on climate change adaptation for the NPS Archaeological Resources in a presentation titled A National Strategic Vision for Climate Change and Archaeology. Dr. Rockman is the U.S. National Park Service Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for Cultural Resources based here in Washington. An archaeologist by training, her research focus is how humans gather, share, remember, and transmit environmental information, particularly during colonization. She's done field work across the American West, Europe, and the Middle East, and worked in environmental compliance in many Western states as well. She came to D.C. as a Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In that capacity, she managed to work archaeology into Homeland Security risk communication with the EPA. Her current role at NPS addresses impacts of climate change on cultural resources and use of cultural resource information in federal to global level adaptation and resilience planning. Marcy has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona, a BSc in geology from the College of William and Mary. She's also a colleague and a friend, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thanks for talking to me today, Marcy.
Great. Is that my signal to take it away?
That is your signal.
Well, I'm really glad. Hi, everyone. This is Marcy, and I will apologize up front. I'm getting over a truly massive head cold, and if I dissolve into a fit of coughing in the middle, I will we'll cut to music, or Dave will take over for a minute. So I just wanted to apologize for that in advance. I'm really pleased to be here, so I thank you. My thanks to Karen for the invitation and Dave for that kind introduction. So as advertised, I will be talking about a national strategic vision for climate change and archaeology, which always sounds very intimidating, but actually we can do this. But what I want to start with is really just jumping right into some examples of how climate change is showing up for archaeology across the service. So without further ado, we're jumping right in. I can advance the slides. There we go. Can you see this? There we go. All right. This is Bandelier National Monument, which is north of Albuquerque in New Mexico, and it preserves and interprets the heritage of ancestral Puebloans as well as earlier human communities with Pueblo structures, kivas, cliff dwellings, rock art, and many archaeological sites. In 2011, the Los Conchas fire burned more than 150,000 acres, including much of the park. While the American Southwest is not unused to fire, this happens in that area, this fire was extremely large and extremely hot, damaging soils, vegetation, and archaeological sites within them during the fire itself, by firefighting activities, and during the severe flooding that followed. While individual fires cannot be directly attributed to climate change, the increasing temperatures and drought that are projected for this area raise the probability that when future fires start, they will be severe, which increases the risk of damaging and losing more of the archaeology and cultural heritage in this area. Now, over on the opposite coast, on the eastern coast, this is Jamestown, which is part of Colonial National Historical Park, and it encompasses the remains of the first long-term English settlement in the New World. This site has a unique relationship with climate change, as true ring studies conducted in the early 2000s demonstrated that in 1607, when the colony was established, the region was going through the most severe drought in over 800 years. So the archaeology of Jamestown Islands provides the opportunity, among many things, to learn about not only how the drought affected the colonists in the early settlement period, but how the local native populations coped with the drought and how they had lived there before the arrival of Europeans and this drought period. Now, Jamestown is along the James River, and it's long been subject to coastal erosion. There is a seawall that was built to protect the site that is itself now more than 100 years old. And I apologize, this particular photo does not actually show that seawall, but it's there. So there's actually an armored seawall that is part of the historic resources at Jamestown. Now, recently, resource managers at the park have noted that while sea level rise is a threat to the site from the side, it is also becoming a threat from below, as it is raising local groundwater tables and essentially saturating archaeological sites from the bottom up. And what this does is it shortens the time frames that we have to address the threat of sea level rise. Moving back across the country, this is it from Gates of the Arctic. Gates of the Arctic up in Alaska includes many areas of permafrost, which are now subject to melting, which results in slumping, which, as I'm sure you all know, can wreak absolute havoc with archaeological stratigraphy. This photo includes a photo of a slump feature, and I'm going to try and use the pointer here to show you where it is. There's a slump feature. Yeah. Okay. That is a slump feature. It is on the edge of Krupa Lake, which is on the north side of the Brooks Range. The Arctic I&M network tracks permafrost slumping as one of its vital signs in this area, and one of the major points for collaboration in the future between the I&M networks and archaeology is getting their vital sign tracking data into a GIS format so that we can relate it to site locations and actually really calculate the risk to sites in this area from this kind of damage. Now, Gates of the Arctic is also one of several parks with ice patches, which are also subject to melting due to warmer temperatures, and this can uncover artifacts and other biological remains. This is a photo of Jeff Rafik with an antler that he found in a Kalak ice patch, which is a relatively short helicopter flight from Krupa Lake, also on the north side of the Brooks Range. Now, Les is going to get 2 slides in this introduction because they have a lot of climate change impacts going on. For sea level rise and storm-related coastal erosion, it's hard to find a place that visually conveys vulnerability more strongly than Cape Krusenstern, which is shown here. Cape Krusenstern is made up of a series of beach ridges that has really human occupation on almost every one of its 114 beach ridges, going further back in time. It's older on the right-hand side of the photo and younger on the right-hand side and older on the left-hand side. From the air, which is obviously where this photo is from, it looks so fragile as though it could just be sort of pulled apart by wind and waves. This is actually a close-up. If you haven't actually seen what some of the house ridges look like, you can see close-up right in the middle. And then we'll try the pointer again. House pits right in the middle there. They're not actually that fragile that they will be pulled apart like big strings, but they are vulnerable to sea level rise and increasing severity of storms in this area. And as well, I also wanted to point out and talk about being pulled apart. You can also have this. This is a close-up of some looting a little bit farther south on the Seward Peninsula on Port Clarence. During my travels in Alaska this past summer, we found very recent evidence of looting there. And it literally had just happened. As Jeff noted, we saw some cans of Coke there, and he said there are actually still bubbles left in the Coke that is in those cans right there. Now, looting is not a direct impact from climate change, but as subsistence practices for the local folks in the area are stressed by climatic changes, along with other development and economic pressures, it's a secondary impact that is affecting the archaeology in the area. This looting was not on NPS property. Actually shown in the middle of this photo is Jeanette Kolsch, who's the superintendent of Bering Land Bridge, but she is very concerned that looting may spread into park areas. So we're very aware of that going on in this area. So this has been just a very brief example of some impacts to archaeology that I wanted you to have in mind. I'm now going to quickly jump into a few other cultural resource situations that I wanted to just bring to your attention. This is Tumacockery, which is in the southwest. Relatively speaking, not so far from Bandelier. It's a mission that was established by Father Eusebio Kino in 1691 when he visited the O'odham people in southern Arizona. And the mission buildings are built of whitewashed adobe, and the current versions of them that are in the park are about 200 years old. Now, in January 2010, winter monsoons brought nearly 4 inches of rain in about 4 days. A short time later, a really large spall appeared about one of the major windows at the mission, resulting in the loss of large sections of adobe and the wooden lintels in the window. The diagnosis of this fault is that the heavy rains really saturated the adobe, weakening the structure. Now, adobe is not a maintenance-free material, but the coincidence of this fall with the heavy rains raises the issue that as climate projections for this area are for heavier rains and for higher temperatures, this combination of forces is going to place increasing stresses on these buildings, which is likely going to increase the chances of spalling both at this park and many of the other parks in the southwest that have adobe buildings. And then speaking of stress on buildings, let me give you one more example for the moment. This is, as I'm sure many of you know, Fort Jefferson at Dry Tortugas National Park down in the Florida Keys. Dry Tortugas is about 2.5 hours boat ride west of Key West out in the Gulf of Mexico. The key on which it sits is in a deep water harbor, and so it was an extremely strategic location in the middle of the 19th century. And the fort was built during the mid-1800s with the key period of construction during the Civil War, and its most famous inmate was Samuel Mudd, who treated John Wilkes Booth after Booth shot Lincoln. He then provided valuable service during a yellow fever epidemic and was released. So there's some really interesting stories there. Now, Fort Jefferson is an excellent demonstration of the laws of physics and chemistry that say that brick, mortar, iron, and seawater are not a sustainable construction combination. The fort was actually never finished, and so it really requires a substantial maintenance input. And in 2010, there's a major collapse of what is known as Front 3. Significant portions of the fort had already been repaired and upgraded with parts of some of the ARA funding. This is what they look like there. But the work on Front 3 had not yet been gotten to yet. Now, the deterioration of Front 3 isn't related to climate change. It isn't due to specific climate change impacts, but the decision of what we are going to do about it must take climate change into consideration. The climate change projections for this portion of the country is that for sea level rise, which is going to affect the moat wall, which you can see along the left-hand sides of the photos, and less frequent but more severe storms and hurricanes. The estimated cost to repair for Front 3 is currently about $13 million, taking into account the very detailed restoration, such as shown in the photo of the repaired section. So given the many needs and concerns across the NPS related to cultural heritage and climate change, making the decision to repair Front 3, it's not a decision that we can make lightly, but a decision not to repair it is also not a decision that we can make lightly. And so with all of the issues facing archaeology, the wildfires, the erosion, the melting permafrost, and the very visible damages that we have going on to buildings such as in the American Southwest with our adobe stresses and the buildings such as at Fort Jefferson, these are all happening at the same time. And the question being faced across the NPS is how do we make good decisions for our cultural heritage and balance all of these stresses. And one of the goals of this national strategic vision that I'll be telling you about is trying to find a way that we can actually balance these different stresses and not be pulled in the direction of some things that are very visible, such as Front 3 on Fort Jefferson, but really take into account the needs of sites up in say, Gates of the Arctic and at Bandelier and balance them with the needs of our buildings and structures elsewhere across the service. Okay, so that's all a bit of a downer and some really hard decisions that are going to have to be made. I am pleased to say that we are really not at sea when it comes to making some of these decisions. The NPS is doing quite a lot with respect to being organized and making good decisions and preparing to make good decisions with respect to climate change. So very briefly here, I just want to introduce you to the overall structure of the Park Service Climate Change Response Program and sort of illustrate where cultural resources overall and then archaeology specifically fits into this. In the middle of this slide is a big map of the current staff of the NPS Climate Change Response Program. There are currently 22 people working essentially full-time on climate change response across the service, which is a pretty substantial number compared to many of our federal family. You can see me in the bubble. Pointer again. Oops. All right. I'm there. And I am the lead for cultural resources within the Climate Change Program, and the other primary person working on cultural resources is Stanton Enomoto over in Hawaii. He is actually based in one of our LCC offices out there, so that is a main component of his time. But he speaks very eloquently and is very knowledgeable, particularly about Native Hawaiians and Indigenous people issues. So between the two of us, we balance back and forth across all of that. The Climate Change Response Program is balanced by the Climate Change Coordinating Group, which includes the director, associate directors, chief of staff, and the high-level folks. They are essentially form the oversight for the Climate Change Response Program. One of the key things I really wanted to mention to you is that one of the things that is coming out of all of these number of people are really a growing family of documents that are attempting to provide guidance and vision and strategy for climate change response. We've got here, I'm pointing to the Climate Change Response Strategy, which was published in 2010. Down in the lower corner, we've got one of what is now several policy memos stating different aspects of climate change response. We have the Climate Change Action Plan from 2012 to 2014, and we are in the process of updating that action plan. Updates on that will be coming soon. I've got a very small graphic here for our handbook for scenario planning, and there are multiple other documents in preparation and that are out there providing structure and some guidance for how to address climate change. Now, the main document that I'm going to build on for the balance of my talk is the Climate Change Response Strategy, so circling that one just here. And if you haven't actually read the Climate Change Response Strategy, I'll give you just a brief overview. One of the main things that the Climate Change Response Strategy sets out is essentially 4 pillars or components of climate change response. These are science, adaptation, mitigation, and communication. Science is working with data, trends, and observations, really figuring out what actually is going on, measuring it, tracking it, monitoring it. Adaptation is to figuring out what to do with the data. So how do we make decisions? How do we come together to do planning and create frameworks for bringing everyone together to work with these really difficult issues? Mitigation is reducing the overall NPS environmental footprint, getting our emissions down and improving sustainability. And then communication is the process of sharing and learning and engaging the NPS and the public with science, adaptation, and mitigation across all of these different issues. And I will say, I've been with the Park Service for about 3 years now, and I was a BPA for 2 years before that, and I've seen many different strategy documents. With the Climate Change Response Strategy, we do use these pillars. We actively work with them, talk about them, build projects that work on them. So it is a very active strategy. Now, one of the key pieces for our talk today is how cultural resources, in particular archaeology, are represented in the Climate Change Response Strategy. And here is just a graphic of the one page in the response strategy that addresses cultural resources. And so I don't expect you to read all that, but I'm just illustrating. There were just a very few points about cultural resources that were included in the original response strategy, and they were all included under the adaptation component. The original points in here are not wrong. They're actually some very good starting points, but they really do not walk out cultural resources and particularly archaeology across science, all of adaptation, all of mitigation, and all of communication. So the strategic vision that we are currently developing, that I'm currently developing and want to tell you about, is actually trying to grow this and really create a fuller and more complete vision for cultural resources. Okay, so what does this look like? I'm going to back up just for a minute to kind of some of our those introductory stories that we talked about. This is what I call the Dread-ations chart, and it is an effort to collect together all of the bad things that can happen in cultural resources from climate change going forward into one PowerPoint slide. Everything from submersion, erosion, inundation, saturation, down to conflagration, desiccation, invasion, and disruption. And because I am responsible for all of the cultural resources, this does try to actually walk out not just what the impacts are for archaeological sites, but also buildings and structures, cultural landscapes, ethnographic resources, and museum collections. I had the chance to present this to a group, including Director Jarvis, and he looked at this and said, this is really depressing. Where does alcoholism fit? And I did tell him that was inebriation or intoxication, and that's also on the secondary effects chart. But the key point for this is that there are many effects of climate change that we can anticipate across the service and across all of our resources. It is a many-to-many relationship. There's no one effect that's going to hit archaeology. There's no one effect for cultural landscapes, and there's no one effect for Alaska. There's no one effect for Florida. It's really a many-to-many relationship, and one of our key challenges is figuring out what the diversity of impacts are across our many parks and our many regions. So that's one goal. The other part of it is this quote. One of the most precious values of national parks is their ability to teach us about ourselves and how we relate to the natural world. This important role may prove invaluable in the near future as we strive to understand and adapt to a changing climate. This is from testimony that Director Jarvis gave in his first congressional hearing back in 2009. And it's really one of the, I find it to be fairly profound. And another just very personal aside, I actually had the chance to hear him talk about this in person. It was my very first congressional hearing that I went to, and I don't remember him saying this specifically, but I do remember Senator Udall asking him a question straight off, and his very first sentence of response was saying how important cultural resources were in the Park Service, and I remember thinking to myself, I would work for that man. And so it's actually, every time I read this, I have this memory of saying it's really an opportunity to try to bring this concept really into being and to activate it and make it work. So we have impacts, we have this idea of learning from, and what the vision that I'd like to put to you is that there's actually a dual relationship between cultural resources and climate change. On the one hand, we have this big range of impacts that are affecting cultural resources and archaeology across the service and all of our different areas. And then on the other hand, we have the capacity to learn from cultural resources. And this is just a very brief collection of possible directions for doing that. Paleoclimatic data, land use history, past social adaptation to environmental and climatic variation, traditional ecological knowledge, the origins of modern climate change, and so forth. And really the literal heart of the vision for archaeology and climate change is that these two parts are equal. We do need to address the impacts on, but one of the reasons we really need to address the impacts on archaeology from climate change is that we can learn from them. They're not just victims, but they are part of the solution. And so what I like to say is really a yin and yang type of relationship. These are dual. And this concept that there is actually this dual component and that these two parts are equal is now actually part of Park Service policy. There is a policy memo called Climate Change and the Stewardship of Cultural Resources that was released last February. And one of the core components of this policy memo, one of the opening statements, if you will, is NPS cultural resource management must keep in mind that, one, cultural resources are primary sources of data regarding human interactions with environmental change, and two, changing climates affect the preservation and maintenance of cultural resources. So it does set up that idea that there are these two parts and that we must address both of them as we address our stewardship of cultural resources and climate change moving forward. Right, so have that idea. How do we actually do that? This is my vision. This is taking those 4 pillars of climate change response, the science, the adaptation, the mitigation, and the communication, and actually setting them both as having 2 parts. One side dealing with the impacts on, and that's on the right-hand side of each of the pillars, and then that there is a learning from part of that pillar, which is on the, I'm sorry, I have it backwards. That stage left, stage right sort of component. On the left-hand side of your scene is the impacts on, and on the right-hand side is the learning from component. There are a lot of words on this slide, and I'm not going to walk you through each one of them, but the real concept is that there are these two components to each side, and that the vision is that ultimately, if we do work on in each of the 8 parts of this framework, then we will be addressing the full scope of cultural resources and climate change, and we will have a fully active program that can really address all of the issues that are coming down on it, and we will be engaging with all of the information that they have to offer us. So that is really the vision, and the goal is really also that this can work as an inspiration for figuring out what climate change projects can look like and what we can do. It's a way of also looking at gaps analysis. But really working in all 8 parts of this in brief sum, that is the big national strategic vision that we have. So what I'm going to do for the balance of my talk is I'm going to walk you through some pieces of this framework to really explain a little bit more about what I mean by some of these concepts. One more point is that all the concepts listed here, while there are a lot of words on this slide, it's not exhaustive. It's intended to be comprehensive to really give some ideas for what these different sides of these different pillars look like. But I'm sure there are additional topics that a lot of us, if we put our heads together, we can think of to add to these. But the idea is really to set out this full vision and say we should be working in all of these different parts. So with that in mind, I'm going to start in the science realm and just walk through a few pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. Right, so looking at vulnerability assessments on the impact side of science, this is one of the key issues that we have thinking about all of the different impacts. Okay, once we're aware of all the impacts, the real nitty-gritty is figuring, okay, which of our resources are most vulnerable to which impacts, how vulnerable are we, because we need to know that before we can start to really figure out what we're going to do about them. There's a basic equation that's been set out for vulnerability assessment that says vulnerability is exposure times sensitivity minus adaptive capacity. When we talk about cultural resources, and particularly archaeology, which does not move on its own, we really run the issue of we don't have a much adaptive capacity. So I've been trying to rewrite that framework or the equation a little bit differently, saying it is climate trends times the material properties of the character-defining features in a given location minus the potential to apply adaptation options to significant aspects of that resource. That's its vulnerability. So a lot of words together, but really trying to get the needs of archaeology into that equation so that we can talk with our natural resource and other colleagues with a common language. Now there have been pull up my pointer again, there have been several vulnerability assessments that have been completed in the Park Service already. There is, back in here, we've got one that was an integrated natural and cultural resource vulnerability assessment that was done for the Badlands back in 2011. This one did not actually assess the vulnerability of archaeology. It really looked more at the ethnographic resources, particularly the plant communities that are collected and used by some of the native communities in the vicinity of Badlands. And it noted that archaeology in the Badlands is susceptible to erosion, but didn't do a deeper dive than that. So it really was a first run at broadly integrating cultural resources and natural resources in a vulnerability assessment. Point Reyes did a very detailed and extensive coastal archaeological vulnerability assessment, and I really point to that as being one of our best examples of what a vulnerability assessment for archaeology can look like. And they really divided up their ecosystems into different sort of microzones and looked at the different impacts in that area. Park Service, particularly in the facilities realm, is looking at sort of broadly taking FMSS data, facilities data, and trying to create some sea level rise tools, particularly for our coastal parks, and say, okay, how do we do this on a broad scale basis, taking sea level rise models and applying them to our different data sets that we have to figure out what is most at risk. So the key point of this thing is we have several projects and initiatives to build on, and we will continue to build on them further. Now, this graph that you probably cannot read in detail in the middle that I'm circling is actually just a placeholder, I would say, for climate change data that is being provided to all parks. We have a climate scientist as part of the climate change response program named Patrick Gonzalez, and my understanding is he is just about done with doing downscale projections for every park and providing every park with essentially a consistent set of projections, graphs, charts, and so forth, so that any two superintendents, they could sit down and say, what does your graph look like, what does my graph look like, and they can look, essentially compare what is coming down the line at them. What will be happening over the next year, Patrick is going to be leading an effort to essentially start up some additional vulnerability assessments, and with the goal of, within the next 2 years, having every park be part of a vulnerability assessment. They will not be assessing every resource in every park, but every park will be part of the vulnerability assessment. When this idea was put to the Climate and Culture group, which I'll talk about in a little bit, there was a very strong request for more training in cultural resources vulnerability assessments. And so this little icon over here is my attempt to show a computer. There will be some vulnerability assessment training webinars coming in the future, and archaeology will definitely be a part of that coming forward. So that's all on the science side and some of the things that are coming forward in the near future. On the learning from side is one of my most favorite examples from one of our Park Service archaeologists, and this is Margot Schwadron. I'm going to point her out in the photo down here. I don't know if she's on the line, but cheers, Margot, if you are on the line. And I just want to mention some of her dissertation research that she did in the shell mounds of the Western Everglades. It's completely fascinating work. Did a lot of baseline work with the mapping and dating, and definitely got some very good baseline data there, showing how tall and how big these things are, and noting that carbon-14 dates were essentially the same on the bottom of some of these shell mounds as they were on the top, suggesting that they actually had accumulated within a very short frame of time, within a generation or so, and that this whole area was abandoned in around AD 1290 to 1300. For those of you who are up on your American Southwest culture history, you know that that time frame is also the time period when many of the sites in that area were abandoned. The Chaco Canyons and Mesa Verdes were abandoned. This raises the question of what was happening in the Everglades. Had they managed to deplete their oyster resources and needed to leave, or did they also experience some climatic downturns? Or was it some composite of the two, an overrun of their resources at the same time that there were climatic fluctuations? I know that Margot has worked with done some isotopic work with her shell to get some more information on sea surface temperatures and some more detailed work in that realm. And I don't know what she's found out, and so that's a big question to myself. But at the moment, she has really put a dot on the climate map. There had not been information prior to her work saying that there was evidence of either climatic fluctuations and human response in this area, and now we do have a big dot in that area. And this is a fantastic example of what archaeology can really add to our paleoclimatic map. Okay, moving on to the adaptation realm. I'm going to be looking at these few pieces. Okay, so on the impact side, and remember adaptation is figuring out what to do with everything that is going on. Once we've identified resources as being vulnerable to different climate change impacts and saying, okay, these ones they're significant, they are at risk, the real big question is, so what do we do? There has been a fair amount of work to date to try and actually lay out some of our, we call them adaptation options. You could also think of them as management options or decision options, and say, right, what have we got? What are our different options? And currently we have a list of 7, everything ranging from no active intervention, saying, nope, we are deciding to not take action, to attempting to offset the stresses or keep the stresses away from a resource, to improving resiliency, managing change, doing some sort of movement, either allowing a resource to move if it is one of the few that is living, or picking something up in movement. Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is our iconic example of that, doing documentation of a resource, or doing some combination that allows us to interpret the change. Now over down in the bottom here, and I'm circling this sort of funnel-looking thing, we've had a very large workshop in New York City last April, building on some of the lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy, that brought together not only Park Service, but also members of the National Trust, State Historic Preservation Offices, several other historic preservation and planning groups to start talking about this. We did not come to full decisions, but trying to bring our partners together to say, what are our options? How do we define these? And what are some of the conditions under which we might choose one option over another? And I will just point to this green thing in the middle, there's a Preserving Coastal Heritage Workshop report where you actually have some really outcomes of a lot of those discussions. And folks were really not comfortable with some of those decisions. It's a really uncomfortable thing to say, no, we won't actively intervene. But we are also trying to agree, sometimes you need that option to be on the list. So we are working on those options. Having options, however, it really doesn't tell you what one to pick. And I'm now circling this other graphic that says Scenario A, Scenario B, Scenario C, and Scenario D. The Park Service has been doing a great deal of work with scenario planning. Actually, to date, there have been 25 different events of scenario planning across the service, working with climate change projections as well as other types of futures, looking at different social trends, budget trends, political trends, trying to say what might our different futures look like, and if certain different sets of possible futures come together, what might we do? What might be coming down the line for our resources? What might be coming down the line for the Park Service? And how might we respond and react to that? So there is now actually a group of folks within the Climate Change Response Program, and I am one of them, who have been trained in running scenario planning workshops. And as of last summer, we sort of recommitted to running a series of scenario planning workshops for different sets of resources in parks in different types of situations. And upcoming this year, I'm now circling another photo down here, we will be doing a big scenario planning workshop at Cape Lookout, which won't be focusing as directly on archaeology, but it will be looking very closely at Portsmouth Village, which is an 18th century village site, which is literally right at sea level rise. It's a very active descendant community, so there are no easy decisions here about this very at-risk site, what to do with it, and how do we protect it. And then we will also be working at Acadia, which has a very interesting mixed set of both natural and cultural resources there. So cultural resources will be very much at the forefront of these scenario planning workshops. And as I understand, Dry Tortugas has put forward a request to do some scenario planning for Fort Jefferson. So that is also on the list, so it's just being planned right now. So there is a lot of work going on in terms of figuring out what to do about it. Now, over in the learning from part of this is one of my favorite examples of all time. And this is one that I have found through my research. It is not through particular Park Service research, but we do cover some of the area that this example covers. So hopefully it is valid enough. And this is an example of the Chumash, who live on the central Californian coast. They are fully visible there in the archaeological record back to about 8650. Very much, yep, that's the Chumash, and they still exist there today. So they have been there for quite a long time. And one of the key, this is why it makes a good comparison with Margot Schwadron's work in the Everglades, they stayed in place during the climatic fluctuations of AD 1290 to 1300. They did experience a great deal of drought during that time. That is very clear from some of the paleoclimatic record in that area. And they did change a lot, both their economy and their settlement systems. You can see in the archaeological record that villages changed sizes, chiefs moved to different places. There was different trade moving, actually trade intensified between the interior valleys and the coastal islands. And there's even some linguistic evidence that they were moving around more to help actually deal with the stresses that they were going through. But they did remain in place. They did not abandon the area, and they remained identifiably Chumash. And so when we're in this realm of talking about what is adaptation, the Chumash are one of the best examples I've seen of this is what a resilient society looks like. They stayed themselves, they adapted their economy, but they remained identifiably themselves. One of the key other issues, however, though, is some of the physical anthropology from this area shows that after 1300, there is definitely a decrease in violent injuries and an improvement in health, which suggests that they did not get through that time without stress, which is another really important component of discussions of what do we mean by a resilient society, what do we mean by adaptation. So the picture of what the Chumash went through that comes out of archaeology and all of the research in that area is a very important example as we start to work on the impact side of the thing. What are we doing? How do we make good decisions? Having this example of a society that actually has been through the fire, so to speak, is a very important one. Moving on, I'm going to move on to the mitigation realm. And I will apologize, actually, in my mitigation examples, I do not actually have good archaeological examples for mitigation. So if any of you think of any as you're listening to me talking, please let me know, because I would love to fill them in. On the impact side of mitigation, we have work by the National Trust, which has demonstrated quantifiably that in most cases, the greenest building is actually the building that already exists. So there is much room in our plans to reduce our carbon footprint in maintaining and actually renovating using our historic building stock. And not, while LEED certified buildings are absolutely wonderful, there is a big role for historic buildings that they continue to play. And of course, within the Park Service, we have our own Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, and this showing right here, there are sustainability guidelines that have already been published on how to help make buildings sustainable. And I know that they are now working on a set of climate change sustainability or guidelines related directly to climate change, so those will be forthcoming. Now, I deliberately put these photos right in the middle because they actually bridge the gap between both impacts and learning from. These are both from Marsh Billings. This is the historic house there, and this is actually their super high-tech, high-pressure wood boiler. The area actually, Marsh Billings, actually is all about conservation, and they still practice sustainable forestry. So the wood that they use in their burner comes from the actual park. They do harvest it there. So it's the sort of low-tech, high-tech combination. And talking with the facility managers there, he says he uses a lot of this high-tech approach, but then he also works with the actual prevailing wind directions when they open windows in the house to get circulation going, and then he uses a lot of old-fashioned caulking. It's one of his favorite things. Caulking gun is his favorite weapon to keep the energy costs down and to keep it as energy efficient as they can. And then way over here on the right-hand side in the learning from is, again, it's not an archaeological example, and it's not actually a Park Service example, though it is directly adjacent to Salem Maritime National Historic Site. But it's the best story that I have found thus far for mitigation. If you walk into, this is in the House of Seven Gables, if you walk into the kitchen area of the House of Seven Gables, that part of the house was built in 1632, and the ceiling is very low, which you might envision if you have been in very early colonial houses. And had one of those experiences, you step in, it's a guided tour, and the tour guide says, right, so you've all noticed the ceiling is right over your head, you're all ducking. That's because people in the 1600s were short, right? And I remember he said that, I'm like, I know that's not the right answer, but, brain working, and he said, right, 1632, chopping wood is hard, New England winters are cold, and heat rises. Therefore, ceilings were low. And it was just I think about mitigation and keeping carbon footprint low all the time, but it was one of those really powerful reminders that there are other ways of living and other ways of building when energy costs are really high. And as you walk through the rest of the house, you can see that as the energy supply situation changed, the ceilings got higher and things got lighter and more open. And it was just such a powerful experience to actually experience that and think about how it is possible to live differently when energy costs are higher is, again, one of those powerful learning from opportunities for mitigation. We're finally going to move into the fourth quadrant of the pillars, which is communication. And I've just gone and circled all of them here because we've got a lot of different things going on, and they all interlink with each other. Right, so on the impact side, multiple things going on. I'm sure as many of you know, Park Service interpretive staff are not given any scripts for how to talk about their resources, that they are trained in how to connect visitors with the parks in which they are visiting and to create these meaningful experiences. So the interpretation program has done a wonderful job in actually creating climate change interpreter training, in actually training them in climate change. This is what it is, and this is how to connect visitors to the climate change experience and to find stories in their parks. And they have actually, this is again my little webinar icon there. They have been doing this remotely for a couple of years now, and I have had the opportunity to be a part of this training, and they already do a very wonderful job in integrating cultural resources and the historic experience into this training. So it is not just a natural resources experience. They do have climate archaeology and historical thinking is very much a part of this training. So I wanted to call that out. We have the Climate and Culture Group, which is essentially a community of practice for anyone interested in cultural resources and climate change. It's primarily, well, we have a lot of cultural resources folks on our list. Currently we have 95 people within our community practice, but it is not all. We have natural resources folks, we have facilities folks, and several partners from around the federal family also part of that. So if you are not part of that and would like to be part of it, please just let me know. I will happily sign you up for it. Two other parts in some of our outreach and sort of dealing with impacts. This is just a web grab in the back of the IUCN World Parks Congress webpage. The Park Service was asked just about 2 years ago to run the climate change program of the 2014 World Parks Congress, which we did in November. It was in Sydney, Australia. And IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, so it very much had nature at its DNA, but the Park Service did make a strong effort to make sure that because we incorporate cultural resources into our climate change response program, that cultural resources was very much a part of our program in Sydney, and it very much was. We had multiple sessions that did look particularly at archaeology and learning from and telling stories. So we did get the word out there that we were very proud of. And then we do work with our partners, and this is here, circling here, the National Landmarks at Risk is a publication from the Union of Concerned Scientists, which came out last May. They are very concerned with trying to get the word out about many of the impacts being experienced by cultural heritage across the country, and many of our colleagues across the service did help them develop case studies for this report. So it is not entirely about the Park Service, but we are definitely featured within it. And we are also working with the Union of Concerned Scientists now on another workshop back in sort of the adaptation realm, looking at questions of what to do about these risks, and that will be coming up later this spring. Now, finally, falling over on the learning from side, I have an initiative that called Every Place Has a Climate Story, and this comes out of some of the work with the interpretation program and trying to say, how do we really coordinate our efforts to get cultural resources and things that we can learn from them better integrated into climate change and into the interpretation program? How do we better communicate everything that we have to say to you? And one of the ideas that came up is really every place, even if we don't have polar bears or glaciers or things that are melting, there's something that we can say from every place that people have been about climate change. And so we currently have a structure of 4 different kinds of stories. One is how can we see impacts on material cultural heritage. This is how we can actually see change happening around us. And when we look at change happening in cultural heritage, you're actually seeing change at a human scale, which really brings it down to a very personal level. We have how did past societies adapt to past environmental change, and this is definitely in the realm of archaeology. Any place that has had people has likely had them live through different climatic episodes, and so we have something to learn from that. Of course, Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon are some of our big, best-known ones, but any place, I actually challenge people, find me a place where there hasn't been people where we can't talk about this. Then we have a question of how did modern climate change come to be? And I credit Katie Bliss at the Matter Training Center for really first bringing this idea up. I thought about it, but she really captured it. She said, I'm looking at Harper's Ferry right now, and I'm looking at the history of industrialization in the U.S. We have so many sites that talk about this. And really, this history is why we have climate change now. And it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but we really need to talk about it. And so we have started looking at many of our industrial sites and saying, how can we talk about the history of industrialization in this place and understand climate change as coming out of the many different initiatives and the priorities that created these sites. And then we, of course, have traditional ecological knowledge in traditional communities and how they are seeing and feeling climate change in their practices and in their knowledge and in what they know. So we currently have a project to start literally listing out all of our different parks and identifying different stories that go with different places. I will just say it's currently in the draft stage, but everyone I have talked to about this says, yeah, I get that, and I want to build that out, and we want to build it out into a set of information for interpreters to use. And I just lost my arrow there. We have proposed developing this further as a potential centennial project. So I'll just say watch this space as more information will be coming forward on that. So that actually brings us through the group, but what I wanted to do is actually just tell you of two new things that are upcoming that hopefully will be really useful for the archaeological community as we look forward to really dealing with climate change. One of them is the Cultural Resources Climate Change Impacts Table, and I know you cannot read it. It is a whole lot of tiny words, but it's just a screen grab of a very large chart that we have built. You saw the Dreadations table earlier in this presentation. It's good for getting it on one PowerPoint slide, but it's not really useful if you really want to dig into it and say, okay, what does changing precipitation really mean for archaeological sites? What does it mean for cultural landscapes and so forth? I've had a young woman working with me over the past year who has done an enormous amount of research and talking with our colleagues across the service and really compiling a detailed referenced table, and I expect some of you on the call have actually helped review this. We are literally at the point now within the next 2 weeks. We'll be sending it out for a final internal review, and then we'll be intending to publish it as a trifold, one of our Park Service brochures, and then it will also be available on the web. So hopefully this will be a useful resource. Again, not exhaustive, but hopefully comprehensive enough to give everyone a good starting point on what impacts from climate change will be for all of our cultural resources. And then we also have in preparation a cultural resources climate change strategy. This whole 2x4 pillar framework that I've been talking to you about, we are in the process of writing this up as an actual companion document to the climate change response strategy so that you don't just happen to listen to me talk about it, you can actually look at it in your hands. And the current outline of it has this sort of framework. We will start with introduction, and the impacts table will be included in the strategy document. Then there will be a section talking about that four-pillar, the dual approach across all 4 pillars, what that means and what that actually looks like. Then some actual practical guidance, what is scenario planning, what is vulnerability assessment, and how do we actually work with different adaptation options for cultural resources. And then a section on international efforts, because Park Service does speak as a national platform for cultural resources and climate change, and we have international partners who are also working at that same level. What can we learn from them, and what do we have to share out to the global community? So I will just say that this is in progress, hoping to have a full draft for review later this spring into the summer. So I will wrap up with actually just 2 final points. I noted earlier that there was the policy memo that came out in February of last year. There's a lot in it. It's about 5.5 pages, fairly densely written, so hopefully comprehensively written. There are 2 points that I really wanted to point out to the archaeological community. As you know, Dave introduced me, I am an archaeologist at heart, and I've had to, by training, and I've had to learn to speak the language of all cultural resources. But I did want to make sure that there are these 2 particular points that were incorporated into the policy memo, because they do really speak to the needs of archaeology and the potential of archaeology. So I'll just quickly point these out. 1, value information from the past. National Register criteria challenge us to identify and manage not only our known and honored heritage, but also to understand how cultural resources can address questions about the past. Such questions must now include how our modern climate situation has come about and how human societies have responded to climatic and environmental variability in the past. What do resilient and sustainable societies look like? The resources in our parks, including the ones we have not yet identified, have a vital role to play in answering these questions for our multiple publics. This really is speaking so much to what archaeology has to offer. We really need the information that comes from archaeology and the ways of living in the world that we don't have any other access to except through our archaeological record. And just to pull from one of the closing points of the policy memo, the process of adaptation will not take us back to the way things have been done before, but it will assist us in making choices in the face of uncertainty and change. Cultural resources remind us of who we are and where we have come from. They offer clues on past climate variability and speak to the many different ways humans have adapted to changing environment over time in our parks and across the country. We need their information and their inspiration. And I will say, I had archaeology in mind when we wrote those words. They are tended to speak very broadly, but archaeology really has so much to say. So that really is what I wanted to say to all of you. That is the vision for our national plan. So I will just say thank you. For those of you who don't know what I look like, this is me and my email address. And with a few minutes left, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Marcy. So if you'd like to unmute your phone and ask a question by phone or use the Q&A tab in the webinar, either way will be fine, and I can read them if they come in over the Q&A.
Sounds good.
And if there are questions in a minute, or in a few seconds, I will ask. Well, I do have a couple questions that I sort of jotted down while you were talking, and so you and I have had more than one conversation about data.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to ask you, so what data sources were important to you as you were developing the national vision, and what kind of data do you need as you move forward and as you develop guidance and that kind of stuff?
I think there are two types of data that are really needed, and one of them really is some of the locational data and trying to understand how we can best access location information. I'm thinking particularly of some of the coastal studies that are being done with facilities management, and they're using FMSS data, which doesn't include some archaeological site location information, particularly for managed archaeological sites, but it doesn't include all of them. And when I would be in meetings and they'd say, okay, well, this is what is at risk, and then my hand would go up and I'd say, I don't think you have all of the resources that are at risk in your data set, and just because there aren't data points there, you also need to know what has been surveyed and what has not, because just because it is a blank space on the map does not mean that there is nothing there. And this usually makes basically everyone else in the table really uncomfortable and really grumpy. And one of the things we really needed was trying to figure out, okay, how do we get the data? How do we interface the FMSS data, which includes pretty much everything else, with the archaeological data, and particularly getting that information on where have we not looked, what areas have not been surveyed. That's a real clincher, because being able to show that easily and quickly is going to be a real help as we start to build these models. And I'm really worried that as we go forward, and a lot of these studies are going forward, if we can't get that information available in a really in a sort of suitable time frame, then what happens is they note it in the report that we didn't include this data, but then the analyses just don't include it, and there's not always the chance to go back and do that again. The other piece of data that I feel like I still can't quite get my hands around is really where we are in terms of the sort of learning from data. Where do we have really interesting and fascinating research projects, either done by Park Service or by scholars from the outside, that we can build into some of these climate stories? I get asked for those stories a lot, and I want to write, I want to talk about them, but it's sort of trying to figure out where do we have that information, where do we know really useful and interesting stuff, and where don't we, and how do we build those kind of databases so that or links to that information so that we can actually tell these stories easily. Yeah.
Anyone else on the line want to chime in with a question for Marcy? Well, I've got one more for you, but I don't know that it may be a little too big for the 2 minutes that we have left. But
try me.
So I'm thinking about the communication piece of what you said, and I'm wondering if you could identify some roles for individual NPS managers or archaeologists as you're moving forward with your work, and then and here's where the question maybe gets too big.
Yeah.
What about citizens and opportunities for those folks and for us to engage with the public on this stuff?
Let's see. One thought immediately comes to mind, and this is I didn't put this on sort of the learning from part. There is currently in development a national climate change interpretation plan, and as I understand, there usually are not national interpretation plans. They're usually done at the park level. So this is the first attempt to really do something very broad, and getting every place has a climate story will be part of that. But one of the things I've started just trying to ask the questions of, it'll be nice to have the national one, but still it comes down to individual parks finding their own climate stories and getting that information together and available and making it a priority to talk about it. So what I like to think of is, and oftentimes that just comes down to making those individual contacts and saying, I have an idea. or I have some information, or I just want to help share that story. So that would be something I'd say is don't wait for the national plan to come out, though that provides some support for that, but try to make communicating information that we know to individual parks that might be interested a priority. Don't be shy about doing that. Let's see. I had another idea and it just went out of my head. I think that's where I'm going to stop for the moment on that. Because
Perfect.
But I'm right out of the project.
Thanks everyone for listening in, and don't forget about next week's webinar. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you all so much.